Hello and welcome to Bolt Ice Podcast, Episode 5. I'm Alex, and this week I'll be talking about my first impressions with the Legend of Zelda series. And when I say first, I truly mean the first of the Legend of Zelda games. It was a few weeks ago that I decided I was going to play through this series and try to get as far as I can before my schedule picks up in September. I've always been really intrigued by the Zelda games. There's such a rich history to delve into, both in how the games are developed and in the game's lore. Once I coupled that with the fact that I love fantasy settings, then there was no reason to hold off on this series anymore. The Legend of Zelda has been undoubtedly influential, so I decided I would play through these games in order of release. That way I can see how the gameplay mechanics and the presentation has evolved. With 3DS in hand, and mind you, I haven't owned the Nintendo platform since the Game Boy Advance, I went back to 1987 and played the NES version of the original Legend of Zelda. Dude, it was pretty great. What I enjoyed the most was what the game allowed me to imagine. The most important aspect in a game for me is how much I'm able to take away from the experience. Whether it's contemplating the gameplay mechanics or being emotionally moved by the narrative, I really value thinking about the game after I've put it down. In this case, what the original Legend of Zelda gave me was a world to imagine. Due to the simple sprites and environments, there's a lot to be fully visualized in my mind. At the end of each gaming session, I couldn't help but imagine what I had just played. Picturing Link just discovering a dungeon or how a boss might move and attack. I had a lot of fun building my own story. I also really enjoyed dungeon exploration, and I know it's been talked about before, but I saw a lot of connections to the Dark Souls series. And this is coming from a guy who hasn't even played a Dark Souls game. The biggest similarity is the non-linear structure that forces you to explore and memorize areas. It's almost impossible for you to discover both games' secrets all by yourself. Talking to your friends or to other fans about battle strategies and hidden paths becomes a huge part of the game's culture. I think that both series have fans that are so addicted because these games tap into a psychological need to explore. Without even knowing it, gamers are constantly asking the question, what's in this forest? What lies beyond that mountain? And do I have the necessary tools to face it? Fortunately, video games are a great medium for this. It's that interactive element that allows for self-discovery. Anyways, back to Legend of Zelda. Man, that game's difficult. So it's the last dungeon, right? And there's a mixture of enemies and obstacles on every screen. There's just too much going on. I can't take it. So I come up with this strategy to pause the game like every other frame, so I had enough time to view all the incoming attacks. So there you go. There's my contribution to all those gameplay discussions. Overall, I thought The Legend of Zelda was great. Originally releasing on the Famicom in 1986, this year marks the series' 30th anniversary. It's amazing to me that even after all that time, there's still a reason for me to go back and play the original. It's an obvious testament to the game's quality and is what makes it a true classic. Next up on my talk, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. I had a lot of fun playing this. It's one of my favorite kinds of games. It wasn't afraid to try something different. What's new? Side-scrolling elements replace the overhead combat and exploration of the original. This effectively puts Zelda 2 in a whole new genre, which, while it may leave fans of the original displeased, may make it appeal to a whole new audience. And the changes don't stop there. It also introduces RPG elements such as leveling and a world map. Both of these I enjoyed a lot, and I wish they were developed upon in future titles. With leveling and choosing what stats to increase, it enables you to build your own Link. This makes a lot of sense. Link is supposed to be a conduit for the player, so allowing him to have different playstyles enforces this. This is also cool because every time you level up, it creates fun little micro debates in your head. Do I stick with a balanced Link, or do I invest in magic for healing purposes? I also really enjoyed having a world map. In the original Zelda, I was never too concerned about saving Hyrule. It's hard to care about a barren land full of enemies. The world map allowed for towns and NPC interaction. Not that it was very deep, but I can work with it. Traveling from one settlement to the other over canyons and oceans gave the game a much more epic scale. With a better idea of how the world functioned, I was that much more invested in it. Speaking of being invested, I like what little ways Zelda 2's story connected to the original. Ganon remains defeated, but his underlings are trying to bring him back with Link's blood. So every time you get a game over, there's this Return of Ganon message. Link still holds 2 pieces of the Triforce from the original, and the last boss has the third. The world map has an area that resembles where the first game took place. That Easter egg specifically stood out to me. It just made the world feel so much more deep. By the end of the game, I was so satisfied with my experience and felt that sense of adventure. But I didn't get there without some critiques. Much like the first game, Zelda 2 is hard, but this time I felt like it was unfairly difficult. What was the most frustrating thing for me was that when you ran out of lives, You weren't just sent back to the start of the dungeon, you were sent back to the starting area of the game. From there, you have to travel all the way back to that dungeon, facing battles and action sequences. It doesn't just stop there, it also resets the experience you gained in that level, which is counterintuitive if you ask me. If the player is having a tough time at their current level, why is it made harder to power up? Though, at the time of its development, it didn't have the conventions and conveniences that we know now. It is what it is, and the difficulty does have the appeal of making each victory that much more fulfilling. Overall, I felt Zelda 2 was good. Its boldness to try something new made it all the more memorable for me. Moving on to my impressions of the Zelda series so far, I really feel like the first two games complement each other so well. Together they create this simple and coherent narrative, and I felt no burnout after playing the games back to back because of their differences in gameplay. It also helps that both are really good games. The original Legend of Zelda is an instant classic, and you should play it, and Zelda 2 proves that the series isn't afraid to mix it up. That's it for me, folks. I hope I was insightful, hope I was thought-provoking. I already can't wait to come back and give you my impressions of the future titles. I'm thinking that in my next Zelda podcast, I'll talk about the third and fourth games, so A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening. Thanks for listening, I had a good time, and I'll catch you later.